Welcome to lecture 22 of our course on high-performance computing. In the previous lecture, we had started a new topic, that of the architecture of pipeline processors. And let me just remind you a little bit about what we had in our opening discussion. The primary perspective of pipeline architecture is that the design of the processor will not be driven so much by a requirement of reducing the execution time of the individual instructions, but rather by increasing the throughput or the rate at which instructions are executed. And the common objective of either of these would have been so the objective is to increase the throughput of instruction execution. Whether one had tried to decrease the execution time of a single instruction or increase the throughput of the rate at which instructions are executed, the common goal was really to reduce the execution time of programs, which is still the case. Now, in the case of pipelining, the idea is to try to keep the different pieces of hardware that are used in the execution of an instruction, as we had seen earlier in this course, busy to the extent possible, as motivated by the point down here. After an instruction has been fetched, is it necessary to keep the hardware that did the fetch idle until that instruction has been fully executed? And the answer, as we briefly saw in the lecture 21, was no, one could do better. And I suggested that the design of pipeline processors may be viewed as having been motivated by the idea of petroleum pipelines, which I briefly introduced with a diagram of this kind, the idea being that petroleum pipelines could be extremely long, running to potentially thousands of kilometers, and they are used to transport liquids or gases over long distances, such as between, let's say, a petroleum refinery and the location of the bulk of the end users. Right now, from this perspective, you'll recall the hardware that we had reasoned out for the execution of an instruction, which included hardware to fetch and then decode or understand the instruction, cause the execution of the instruction, do any memory operation that may be required, and write the result of the instruction, which we have now abstracted into these 5 color-coded boxes. And this will be our perspective on the simple hardware for execution of MIPS-like instructions. And the simple idea of processor pipelining, as we saw it last time, when we looked at the timeline, which I have now discretized in terms of clock cycles. So from now on, for the discussion of pipelining, when we look at the timeline, we consider cycle 1 followed by cycle 2, and are not too much concerned about the activity, the different pieces of activity that happen within the cycle. So the timeline has been discretized. And if one instruction, the first instruction to be executed, occupies the instruction fetch hardware for the first cycle, and subsequently occupies the instruction decode hardware for the second cycle, and so on, we see that the second instruction to be executed, the instruction following the first instruction in the program, could actually use the instruction fetch hardware in the second cycle. In other words, as soon as the first cycle has finished being fetched, the second instruction could be fetched, thereby allowing a much greater throughput of instruction execution. As we had summarized towards the end of the class, even though a single instruction does still take 5 cycles to be executed, instructions are completing at the rate of 1 per cycle. Instruction 1 completes in cycle 5, instruction 2 completes in cycle 6, instruction 3 completes in cycle 7, and so on. And this is a substantial improvement over an instruction completing only every 5 cycles. So it looks like pipelining has this substantial benefit from the performance side. I will remind you that our discussion of pipelining opened with the question, from the performance perspective, which is preferable, reducing the execution time of each instruction or improving the throughput, the rate at which instructions execute. And here we see that there's great potential for improving the performance, in other words, the speed with which programs are executed. Okay, now let's look back a little bit at what our analysis of the MIPS-1 instruction requirements had led us to. You'll recall that we had defined what the activity that could be done in hardware in 1 cycle, and based on that definition, we had sort of deduced that the different MIPS instructions could either be executed in 3 cycles, 4 cycles, or 5 cycles. And looking at our discretized timeline, let's look at a few examples. Now, once again, we're concentrating on pipelining. But let's consider a situation where the first instruction which is going through the pipeline is a load word instruction. And I'll remind you that in the case of the load word instruction, the number of cycles that it took to execute in our analysis of the simple processor, which was not pipelined, was that it took 5 cycles to execute. This was the instruction which took the complete, which actually used each of the 5 steps in instruction execution completely. And therefore, if I drew the use of the different pieces of hardware along the timeline, and from now on I may not even show you the ticks on the timeline unless they're absolutely essential. So you just understand that instruction 1 spends the first clock cycle in IF and so on. Time is now discretized, and therefore these boxes will provide us a picture of what's happening on the timeline. So the load word instruction actually takes these 5 cycles to execute. Now let's suppose that the second instruction, which is going to enter the pipeline just after the load word instruction, is an add instruction. And I'll remind you that the add instruction actually requires a cycle to be fetched, a cycle to be decoded, a cycle to execute, and a cycle to write back, but does not require a cycle for any memory activity, since it takes its operands out of registers and stores the result into another register. So it does not really require a cycle in which to do a memory operation. So if I analyze what in a pipelined implementation of the MIPS1 instruction set, very clearly the add instruction could be fetched in cycle 2, because the instruction fetch hardware is no longer being used in the fetching of the first instruction. Just proceeding along the timeline, it's clear that the add instruction can be decoded and its operands can be fetched in cycle number 2, which is, in cycle number 3, which is why I show the ID, the gray box for the add instruction, as happening in cycle number 3. Note that the ID hardware is no longer being used by the first instruction. The ID of the first instruction had been completed in cycle number 2. Similarly, I proceed down the timeline and I see that the execution, in other words, the adding of the value inside R1 to the value inside R2, can take place for the add instruction in cycle number 4. Now, the question now is, the add instruction does not require the MEM stage, and therefore I could think of actually using the write back hardware for the add instruction in cycle number 5, but unfortunately the write back hardware is being used in that cycle by the load word instruction, and therefore the earliest that the write back hardware can be used for the add instruction would be cycle 6. And in some sense we understand that even though we show a blank box for what's happening as far as the add instruction is concerning in cycle number 5, in reality we could view the cycle, that particular cycle, as being used by the add instruction in the MEM stage, even though the instruction doesn't require the MEM stage. In other words, the MEM hardware need not be occupied doing something for the add instruction, but it's not going to be occupied anyway, and therefore I'll just show it in this hashed mode, indicating that the MEM hardware is in some sense being used by the add instruction in cycle number 5, and is therefore still in green, but I'm showing it in this hashed mode. So the bottom line was that the add instruction could not finish in 4 cycles, because it could not do the write back in cycle number 5, since the write back hardware was currently being used by the previous instruction. So there was no benefit from trying to design the processor pipeline so that the write back of the add instruction happened in cycle number 5. The possibility was not there. Let's look at a few more examples of instruction sequences to understand a little bit more about what's going to happen behind the scenes with the pipelines. Now, a second example, let me assume that the first instruction going through the pipeline is the load word instruction. And you'll remember about the load word instruction that it certainly has to be fetched, it certainly has to be decoded. There is an execution operation associated with it, and that is because the effective address, in other words, the addition of the contents of register R2 with the displacement, must be done. There is a need for memory operations, since this is a load word instruction, and there is a need for the write back because this is the need to update register R1. And this is the same as we had seen in the previous slide. Now let's suppose that the load word instruction is followed by a jump register R6 instruction. Now the thing to remember of the jump register R6 instruction is that it certainly requires the use of the IF stage. It has to be fetched, as any instruction does. Similarly, it requires the use of the ID stage, in that it must be decoded and its operand must be fetched. Its operand is R6. The target address is contained in the register R6. There is the need for, in fact, in the case of the jump register instruction, there is not really any need for the EX stage, because the target address is immediately available in R6, and there's no need for the MEM stage either, because there's no computation to be done. And therefore, the next piece of activity as far as the jump register instruction is the updating of the program counter in the write back stage. And once again, we see that the possibility of actually this is an example of an instruction which would conceivably finish in 3 cycles, since it needs only the IF hardware, the ID hardware, and the write back hardware. And the possibility which we may have considered is that the write back hardware could be used by the jump register instruction in cycle number 4, before it has been used by the load word instruction. So the load word instruction is going to use the write back hardware in cycle number 5. Now, we need to sort of look at this in a slightly more holistic perspective. Now, we've started by assuming that load word instruction was the first instruction in the pipeline, but remember that during program execution, the load word instruction followed by the jump register instruction may have followed other instructions. In other words, there could have been an instruction preceding the load word instruction, such as an add instruction. And if there had been, then the add instruction would have been using the write back hardware in cycle number 4. In other words, the instruction before the load word instruction. Hence, for the same reason that we argued with the previous example, we can now argue that the jump register instruction cannot use the write back hardware in cycle number 4, because it would conceivably be in use by the instruction before the load word instruction in that cycle. It cannot be used in cycle number 5 either, and therefore the earliest that we can use the write back hardware for the jump register instruction would be cycle number 6. So once again, since cycle number 4 and 5, during cycles number 4 and 5, no useful activity as far as the jump register instruction are taking place, what I will do is I'll just assume that the EX hardware and the MEM hardware in this hashed mode are sort of passed through or not being used for the execution of the steps of the instruction, but are in some sense being occupied by the jump register instruction in cycle 4 and cycle number 5, prior to the write back hardware being used in cycle number 6. And again, one way to view this is that in the hardware that we had outlined, the information was flowing from the IF stage through the write back stage, the information pertaining to any one instruction, and therefore the EX stage and the MEM stage are providing the path for the flow of the information from the ID hardware through the write back hardware. And this will keep things nice and simple if we once again just view the jump register instruction as, though conceivably taking only 3 cycles, actually occupying all the 5 cycles. In other words, all the 5 pieces of hardware associated with instruction execution. Right, so if I look at the pipeline from this perspective, we now have this picture of the 5 pieces of hardware associated with instruction execution, exactly as they were before. But there is this notion of one instruction, let's say instruction I5 being fetched, while instruction I4 is being decoded, while instruction I3 is being executed, and instruction I2 is using the MEM hardware, and instruction I1 is being written back. And I write the instructions in that order, assuming that instruction I1 is the first among them to be executed in program order. So this is the order in which your program is executing the instructions. And if I looked at the hardware within the processor, I might find instruction I1, in other words, the first of them, occupying the write back hardware, at the same time that instruction I5, the last of them, is occupying the instruction fetch hardware. Now, to make this work, it may be necessary to remember some of the information that is being passed between the IF stage and the ID stage. We had talked about some special purpose registers in our discussion of the pipeline, and therefore what I'm going to assume in talking about a pipelined implementation of the processor is that there may be a need for some buffering of that kind or some memory of that kind, and that is what will be indicated by these yellow boxes, yellow rectangles, which are now shown between the 5 pieces of hardware. So there are these 4 rectangular boxes, and we could think of them as containing some kind of buffering or some kind of memory required to transfer information from the previous piece of hardware to the next piece of hardware. And in some sense, we had seen this idea in the form of some registers, but this is just to allow for the requirements of pipelining the processor. Some additional information may have to be remembered. So the bottom line is that we are going to assume that without a great deal of additional complication being added to the hardware that we have already seen, the ordinary processor that we had looked at, which we now refer to as the processor data path, the pathways through which data and information and instructions flow through the processor for execution, and the pipelined equivalent may not be that much different. We'll sort of work with that assumption. Some additional buffering, some additional small amount of control may be required. Okay, now in terms of some of the terminology that we're going to use, up to now I have talked about the 5 pieces of hardware that we had reasoned out as being necessary for the execution of an individual instruction. We have now put them together with some amount of buffering in between them, which I'm not generally going to show in the diagrams. But in referring to any one of these pieces of hardware, it's often the most common term which is used is to refer to them as the pipeline stages, or the stages of the pipeline. So I'll talk about the IF stage, or the instruction fetch stage, the write back stage, or the WB stage of a pipeline. Now, this particular pipeline has 5 stages, and I could therefore describe it as a 5-stage pipeline. One could imagine that there could be pipelines which are designed to have a smaller or a larger number of stages, and you could imagine it along these lines. In our discussion of the different steps involved in executing an instruction, we had packaged the different steps into these 5 pieces of hardware, but we could conceivably have packaged them into, let's say, 10 smaller pieces of hardware, and then we would have now been talking about 10 pipeline stages with different names, and we would be talking about a 10-stage pipeline. Another way of describing this is that some people talk about a pipeline of depth 5 rather than talking about a 5-stage pipeline. So this notion of the depth of a pipeline. Now let's think about pipelines a little bit. Until now, when we talked about the 5 pieces of hardware, we were working with some rough understanding of how much work can be done by hardware in one clock cycle. The clock cycle is defined by some hardware clock associated with the processor. And we were working towards having about the same amount of work being done in each of the 5 pipeline stages. And we'll continue with that assumption. I'll assume that it takes one clock cycle to finish the work of any one of these pipeline stages. So they're equal as far as the time delay through the stage is concerned. I can therefore think about a concept of speed up. Now, the principle behind trying to come up with this speed up is that we understand that by using a pipelined processor rather than by using a processor which is not pipelined, in other words, one without the buffering, one in which a single instruction is completely executed before the next instruction is fetched. So I could compare the performance of a pipeline processor with the performance of an equivalent non-pipeline processor using this measure called pipeline speedup. And pipeline speedup is defined as the time that it takes to execute, let's say, a particular program with a particular input data on the non-pipelined implementation of the processor, divided by the time that it takes to execute that same program on the same input on a pipelined version of the program, on a pipeline version of the processor. So we're assuming the same instruction set, we're assuming the same program, the same input data. So you run it, you build a pipeline version of a processor which can execute those instructions. You build a non-pipeline version. You measure the time that it takes on each, and the ratio of the two. You notice that we hope that the denominator, the time on the pipeline processor, will be less than the time on the non-pipeline processor, and the pipeline speedup should, we hope, be greater than 1. That's our hope. And this is the term speedup is used in other contexts as well, which is why I qualified by the term pipeline in front. We're trying to measure how many times faster a program can become, the execution, by using a pipelined implementation. Okay, now let's try to calculate the potential pipeline speedup for our five-stage pipeline, or a pipeline of depth 5. The way we'll do this is, we'll start by restating our assumption. I'm going to assume that it takes one stage. Each stage of the pipeline takes one cycle. And I'm going to compute the speedup over a non-pipeline processor that takes 5 cycles for every instruction. Now, I know that I could build a non-pipeline processor which takes 5 cycles for some instructions, 4 cycles for other, and 3 cycles for yet others. But I'll compute the speed up in terms of a pipeline processor which takes 5 cycles for every instruction. And the reason is, it'll be a little difficult to talk about the number of cycles that it takes for an instruction in the absence of the program. If I have a program which contains only jump register instructions, then very clearly every instruction takes 3 cycles in the non-pipelined version. So this is just an assumption to allow us to talk in terms of programs in general rather than specific programs. Okay, now what we'll do is we need to calculate how much time it will take to run a program on the pipeline processor, and we'll have to calculate how much time it takes to execute the same program on a non-pipeline processor. And what I'm going to start off with, I'm going to assume that the execution of the program involves the execution of n instructions. N could be 10,000, it could be 1,000,000, it doesn't matter. We're just going to use this notation that the number of instructions which are going to be executed in order for the program to run completely is n. Now we can reason about how many cycles it will take as far as execution on the non-pipeline processor is concerned. Now we know that on the non-pipeline processor, it takes 5 cycles for every instruction. If there are n instructions, then the total time to execute this program will be 5n cycles. So that's easy to see. What about the case of the pipeline processor? Now, I know that in the case of the pipeline processor, when the program starts executing, in the first cycle, no instruction will complete. It's a 5-stage pipeline. So in the first cycle, the instruction I1, the first instruction will get fetched. In the second cycle, instruction I1 will get decoded, and instruction I2 will be fetched, and so on. And I know that for the first 4 cycles, no instruction will finish execution. However, every cycle after that, if I'm lucky, an instruction will finish execution. Therefore, I can argue that the total number of cycles required to execute the program of n instructions on the pipeline processor will be 4 plus n. So for the first 4 cycles, the pipeline fills up, and for every cycle after that, hopefully, an instruction will finish execution. And therefore, the n instructions will take 4 plus n cycles. And therefore, I can compute the speed up as 5n divided by 4 plus n. Now, this is interesting. It doesn't give me any particular insight. But I could then think about the scenario where n becomes larger and larger. You know that the 5n divided by 4 plus n is not very interesting when n is equal to 1, because when n is equal to 1, in other words, if the program takes 1 instruction, the program's execution involves only 1 instruction, then the speed up is going to be 5 divided by 5, which is 1. If there are only 2 instructions, then this is 10 divided by 6, which is 1 point something, and so on. But what if n is very large? For example, what if n is many millions or many billions? So the typical case that we are concerned about is where there are large programs in execution, where we're more concerned about the speed up for large programs than the speed up for small programs, because small programs take a small amount of time anyway. So one could actually look at this expression for speed up in the limit as n tends to infinity, and get some feel for the significance of this speed up. And if you take the limit as n tends to infinity, you'll notice that this tends to 5. So the thing to note here is that for extremely large programs, I could actually expect that the program would run 5 times faster on the pipeline processor than it would have run on the non-pipeline processor. Now this is interesting because we note that 5 comes from, if you look carefully at the derivation, the 5 in this result is coming from this term, and that term is coming from the number of cycles that it takes for every instruction to execute on the non-pipelined implementation, which was actually coming from the number of stages in the pipelined processor. Therefore, rather than thinking about the case where there are 5 stages in the pipeline processor, if I now try to generalize to the case where there are p stages in the pipeline processor, let's say 20, 30, whatever, then I could argue along the same lines as in the previous slide that I could expect a speed up of p if I'm comparing the pipeline processor with a non-pipeline processor that takes p cycles to execute each instruction. In other words, if I had a pipeline with 20 stages in it, I might expect that pipeline processor would be capable of executing an instruction 20 times faster than the non-pipelined equivalent. Okay, so this is now becoming an interesting situation. The 5-stage pipeline with the speed up of 5, maybe not, but the 20-stage pipeline with the speed up of 20, capable of executing programs 20 times faster, thanks to the paying our attention to the rate at which instructions are executed rather than the time for the execution of any one instruction. Right? So the way to interpret the speed up of p is a program would conceivably run p times faster on the pipeline processor than on the non-pipeline processor. And once again, for large values of p, this is an extremely good result. We have done something very positive by thinking about pipeline processors from the perspective of the performance of the processor and the satisfaction of the person running programs on the processor. Right? Of course, this is built on the assumption that on every clock cycle, an instruction completes execution. If you look back at the derivation, I had over here, the time for the pipeline processor was the pipeline fill time, which was P. In the current example, it's going to be P minus 1. Right? For the 5-stage pipeline, there was a fill time of 4. For the P-stage pipeline, there will be a fill time of P minus 1. And then I was assuming that every cycle after that, an instruction could complete. So that's the caveat that I've written over here. So the speed up of P will result if on every clock cycle an instruction completes execution. And the question is whether this is going to be achievable in practice. Now, we're going to next spend some time looking at one of the problems with programs because of which this is not typically going to happen. So this is not always going to be the case, that every clock cycle an instruction is going to complete. Now, the situations in which it is not possible for an instruction to complete every cycle arise out of problems within the pipeline due to different kinds of instructions, and these problems are known as pipeline hazards. Basically, a pipeline hazard is a situation where an instruction cannot proceed through the pipeline as it should. Right? And if an instruction cannot proceed through the pipeline as it should, in other words, from IF to ID to EX to MEM to write back during consecutive cycles, then it's not going to be possible for an instruction to complete every cycle. So the question is, what are the different kinds of hazards that could arise in the kind of pipelines that we have seen for the kinds of programs that we expect we may have to write? But before that, let me just explain. The term hazard in general means a dangerous, hazardous situation. And in the case of the pipeline hazards, the danger arises not from some physical danger, but from the fact that if the instruction is allowed to proceed through the pipeline, stepping through stages of the pipeline in consecutive cycles, then what could happen is the correctness of the program could be compromised. So this is a hazard that one has to worry about from the perspective of designing the hardware. So the term pipeline hazard is of concern to the people who design the hardware. They have to make sure that programs run without these hazardous situations resulting in incorrect program execution. Correct program execution is essential. Otherwise, the processor is not doing what the programmer intended his instructions comprising his program to do. Right, so with this understanding of what a hazard is, let me outline what the different kinds of pipeline hazards that one has to worry about are. Now, the first kind of pipeline hazard that architects worry about is something called the structural hazard. And the term structural hazard is used for situations where instructions in the pipeline need to use the same resource of the pipeline at the same time. In other words, it is because two of them need to use the same resource at the same time, hardware resource of the pipeline, that it is not safe for them to proceed through the pipeline as they should, stepping to the next stage in the pipeline in the next cycle. Therefore, something to do with pipeline resources, the hardware resources of the pipeline. That's what the structural hazard is. We'll see more about structural hazards shortly. The second kind of hazard which the architect and the programmer has to worry about is something called the data hazard. It relates to the data that the instructions of the program are manipulating. And it describes a situation where an instruction depends on the data result of a prior instruction that is still in the pipeline. In other words, there's a situation where there's one instruction which is somewhere in the beginning of the pipeline. There's another instruction which is somewhere towards the middle or the end of the pipeline. And it is the second instruction that is producing a result that is of relevance to the instruction earlier in the pipeline. So there's some kind of a data relationship between the instructions, as a result of which it is not safe for the instruction maybe earlier in the pipeline to proceed through the pipeline as it should. So that is known as a data hazard. Note that this is distinct from the structural hazard. Structural hazard arises because two instructions require the same piece of hardware at the same time. The data hazard arises because an instruction needs a piece of data that another instruction in the pipeline is supposed to produce. So it's some kind of a producer-consumer type of a problem. if the producer has not yet produced the piece of data, then the consumer is not going to be in a position to proceed through the pipeline as it should until the data has been produced. Now, the last kind of hazardous situation that I'm going to talk about is something called the control hazard. And as the name suggests, this is a kind of a hazardous situation that arises due to control transfer instructions. And we'll see each of these in a few slides in the discussion to follow. Let's start by looking at the structural hazard. So this is a situation where two or more instructions in the pipeline need to use the same resource at the same time. The best way to understand the structural hazard will be to look at an example. So let's proceed to look at a situation that could arise as instructions are using the hardware resources. In other words, the IF, ID, EX, MEM, write-back pieces of hardware comprising the pipeline. So let's suppose that the first instruction of interest to us, which I'll describe as instruction I, is a load word instruction. So the load word instruction will be fetched in the first cycle. It will be decoded, fully understood in the second cycle, and its operand, the value of R2, will be fetched. In the third cycle, the value of 8 plus the value inside R2 will be calculated. And in the fourth cycle, the cache memory will be, the address which was computed in the third cycle will be sent to the cache memory, where the data will be read. Finally, in the fifth cycle, register R3 will be updated. So we know exactly what happens as far as the load word instruction is concerned. It occupies all the 5 cycles. Now, let's suppose that there is an instruction following the load word instruction, and I had talked about the load word instruction as being instruction number I. So the instruction that follows it is the instruction number I plus 1, and I'm not too concerned about what that instruction is. In fact, let's suppose that the instruction following instruction I plus 1, which we call instruction I plus 2 is also not, we're not too concerned about what the instruction is. So we have a situation where the load word instruction was executing between instructions 1 and 5. The instruction that follows it was from cycles 2 to 6. The instruction that follows that was from cycles 3 to 7, and so on. Now let's consider the next instruction, the instruction which we'll call I plus 3. Now that instruction is supposed to be fetched in cycle number 4. And if we look back and see what the other instructions are doing in cycle number 4, instruction I plus 3 is using the IF hardware, instruction I plus 2 is using the ID hardware, instruction I plus 1 is using the EX hardware, instruction I is using the MEM hardware. It looks like none of them are trying to use the same piece of hardware at the same time. And you may be wondering, what kind of a structural problem is there? Each of them is using a different piece of hardware. Nothing could go wrong. But let's think a little bit about what is happening as far as instruction I is concerned and instruction I plus 3 are concerned. Now, in what instruction I is doing, the instruction I, the load word instruction, is doing a memory operation, which means that it is using the cache in cycle number 4. What is instruction I plus 3 doing? It is being fetched. And once again, we understand that in order to be fetched, if main memory is not going to be used, then instruction I plus 3 must be using the cache memory. So here we have what may be called a structural hazard. We have a situation where in cycle number 4, in other words, at the same time, instruction I and instruction I plus 3 both need to use memory. Both have to access memory. One in order to read a piece of data, the other in order to access an instruction. But the fact remains that both of them need to use the same hardware resource, memory, or cache in this particular case, at the same time. And this is a situation where the same piece of hardware, and therefore we refer to this as a structural hazard. In cycle number 4, instruction I and instruction I plus 3 both need to use memory or cache in our, based on our assumptions about how the processor operates. And therefore this has to be classified as a hazardous situation. These two, the same hardware resource cannot be used by two instructions at the same time. Okay, now let's just go to our petroleum pipeline analogy. Since I've raised the analogy of the petroleum pipeline, I thought I should use it at some point or the other. And is there any kind of equivalent for hazardous situations as far as the petroleum pipeline is concerned? Now, let me just remind you, the pipeline is this pipe, very long pipe, which runs, let's say, from a refinery to a city. And it can be used, for example, for transporting the different products of crude petroleum from the refinery. The refinery takes in crude petroleum and breaks it up into its different products like kerosene, diesel, airline fuel, etc., and then transports it through the pipeline to the end user. So let's suppose that let's suppose this is a 1,000-kilometer pipeline, and currently we are using it to transfer some volume of kerosene. Let's suppose that it's about 200 kilometers within the pipeline. We're using it to transport some volume of kerosene from the refinery to the city. So that's what the pipeline is currently being used for, and is going to be used. The way that this happens, as we saw, is by pumping the kerosene through the pipeline. It's not progressing through the pipeline by some gradient, by the fact that the pipeline is sloping down. It's progressing because it's explicitly being pumped. Okay, now let's suppose that at this point in time, the kerosene fraction is occupying the pipeline, and we need to start off, or we actually want to also transport, let's say, this looks like about 400 kilometers in terms of the pipeline, some large volume of diesel from the refinery to the city. Now, the situation that we have is we could immediately start pumping the diesel into the pipeline. As soon as the 200 kilometers of kerosene had been pumped into the pipeline, we could start pumping the diesel into the pipeline. But the problem that could arise now is that the diesel and the kerosene and the diesel would mix, producing something which is neither kerosene nor diesel, and the end user would not be very happy. Therefore, this is something like a hazardous situation in the instruction execution pipeline, where there are instructions that are interfering with each other. And the question is, in order to solve the pipeline in the instruction execution scenario, can we derive some kind of insight from the petroleum pipeline scenario? So when we have these two volumes of fluid which interfere with each other when they are going through the pipeline, how can we remove that problem as far as the petroleum pipeline is concerned? And the answer to the question which may arise in your minds in terms of the petroleum pipeline is that before pumping the diesel volume into the pipeline, if I actually pump some air into the pipeline, in other words, the kerosene is progressing, is being pumped through the pipeline from the refinery to the city, but before pumping the diesel into the pipeline, if I pump some air into the pipeline, and then I pump the diesel into the pipeline, then there's no danger of the kerosene and the diesel interfering with each other. So if I say that for the 200 kilometers of kerosene in the pipeline, I pump 1 kilometer of air into the pipeline, and I'm not an expert in pipeline technology, so I don't know if 1 kilometer is even necessary, and I'm not even sure if this is how they resolve these problems in pipelines, but it seems like a satisfying solution. And subsequently we pump the large volume of diesel through the pipeline, then the diesel and the kerosene will not bother each other. So there's this notion of pumping air into the pipeline, the petroleum pipeline, and technically, instead of talking about it as air, I could talk about it as inserting a bubble of air into the petroleum pipeline. So a large bubble, maybe 1 kilometer in size, just to separate the kerosene from the diesel. And we could try to think of using exactly the same kind of an idea in the case of the instruction execution pipeline. To separate instructions from doing dangerous things, we could pump air into the pipeline. There must be an analogy of what it means to pump air into the pipeline. Okay, so going back to a structural hazard, we had this situation where in cycle number 4, the instruction I and instruction I plus 3 both needed to use the same hardware resource. And for the moment, I'm referring to it as memory, but you could think of it as cache, right, without loss of generality. So what could be done to prevent this hazardous situation from resulting in something going wrong? Now, very clearly, in cycle number 4, since the hardware resource is currently being used by instruction number I, it cannot be used by instruction I plus 3. And therefore, we could draw the analogy of the petroleum pipeline and say that as far as instruction I plus 3 is concerned, it will have to, instead of pumping instruction I plus 3 into the pipeline in cycle number 4, I actually might need to pump some air into the pipeline in cycle number 4 instead of instruction I plus 3. And I'll actually show it by a bubble of air going into the pipeline. And the need for pumping this bubble of air into the pipeline is that in cycle number 4, instruction I plus 3 cannot use the resource, namely the cache, because in cycle number 4, that particular resource is being used by another instruction. Hence, use the petroleum pipeline solution and pump air into the pipeline. Now, what does it mean to pump air into this electronic pipeline? Well, very clearly, pumping air using a pump or a fan or something is not going to help the correct execution of instructions. So we're just drawing an analogy. But what seems to be the case in the case of the petroleum pipeline, what was the purpose of pumping air? The purpose of pumping the air was to postpone the arrival of the diesel into the pipeline. And that's exactly what we'll view the purpose of the air over here. What we mean by the bubble of air in the pipeline is that we are postponing the fetching of instruction I plus 3 from cycle number 4 until cycle number 5 possibly, which is why I show instruction I plus 3 as being fetched in cycle number 5. And if I look back at the other activities in cycle number 5, it could well happen that there's no other use of the cache memory and that therefore this is a safe use of the instruction fetch hardware as far as instruction I plus 3 is concerned. Therefore, by pumping a bubble of air into the pipeline in cycle number 4, instead of using that cycle for fetching instruction I plus 3, I have avoided the problem. It's no longer the case that instruction I and instruction I plus 3 are using the cache at the same time. Notice that instruction I is using the cache in cycle number 4 and instruction I plus 3 is using the cache in cycle number 5. And therefore, there is no structural problem. It's not a situation where two instructions are using the same hardware resource at the same time. Now, what happens to this bubble? You'll notice that I've sort of conceptually shown this bubble as progressing through the pipeline just like an instruction would. Because if you think about it, if the instruction fetch hardware was not being used in cycle number 4, but only in cycle number 5, then what will happen to the instruction decode hardware in the next cycle? The answer is there will be no instruction which needs to be decoded. And therefore, there will actually be a bubble of air in the instruction decode hardware in the next cycle. Similarly, there will be a bubble of air in the instruction EX hardware in the next cycle, and so on. So one can actually view the bubble of air as progressing through the pipeline, just like an instruction. So the net result was that by delaying instruction I plus 3 by one cycle, we were able to overcome the structural hazard. You'll notice that there is a performance consequence of doing this. You'll notice that in in cycle 5, one instruction completed. In cycle 6, another instruction completed. In cycle 7, another instruction completed. But in cycle 8, no instruction completed. It was only in cycle 9 that the next instruction completed. And therefore, by taking this approach to dealing with the structural hazard, we are actually causing there to be one cycle in which no instruction completes. And therefore, our assumption about one instruction completing every cycle through which we calculated the pipeline speedup is actually not going to result if we use this kind of an approach to dealing with structural hazards. Okay, now, there are clearly going to be alternatives, and the alternative which I outline in this slide is that it should be possible to design the hardware so that if we can identify all the situations where there could be two instructions which require the same hardware resource at the same time, maybe we could design the hardware so that it can handle the multiple requirements at the same time. A simple example is, we had this scenario where both instruction I and instruction I plus 3 required the use of memory in cycle number 4. And therefore, I could conceivably have designed memory so that it could actually handle two requests at the same time. And that kind of memory is actually not uncommon. It's called, people do design memories to be able to handle multiple requests at the same time, and therefore it's not an infeasible idea. But in our particular setting, we could do even better. We could say, since we know that main memory is not going to enter the picture too often from the perspective of instruction fetches or data fetches or stores, but most of the time this would happen through cache memories. We haven't understood fully what a cache memory is. But we could handle the problem that we have seen by having a separate cache for data and a separate cache for instructions. And by separating the cache into two caches, we actually diffused the structural hazard problem that had arisen in the example that we have. Therefore, in general, one could argue that wherever structural hazards can be anticipated by the person who has designed the pipeline, the structural hazard can also be resolved by suitably designing the hardware so that the structural hazard does not become a situation where a bubble of air, where a cycle of non-activity has to be pushed through the pipeline. Right, so in the slide I outline how if you have separate separate cache for instructions and a separate cache for data, then the instruction cache would be used by the IF pipeline stage, and the data cache would be used by the MEM pipeline stage, and therefore there would not be a situation where two different instructions require the same piece of hardware, the same cache in the same cycle. And again, for any other kind of structural hazardous situation, the person designing the hardware could use reasoning to diffuse the situation by suitable design of the hardware. So in some sense, we could assume that in modern processors, structural hazards are likely to be handled in this way. In other words, the architect would identify the possible structural hazards and do the design of the pipeline hardware and its resources so as to eliminate them. Okay, now moving right along, now that we've seen what a structural hazard is, we've seen how a structural hazard could be handled. In fact, we saw two ways that a structural hazard could be handled, one using the pipeline analogy of pumping air through the pipeline, the other that of designing the pipeline so that structural hazards are diffused by suitable design of the components, the resources of the pipeline. We'll move on to the next kind of pipeline hazard, which I had labeled as the data hazard, a situation where an instruction depends on the data result of a prior instruction that is still in the pipeline. So once again, let's try to understand what a data hazard would look like by looking at an example. Okay, now in this example, once again, I have instruction I, which is fetched in cycle 1, decoded, executed, written, MEM, and write back. So you'll note that in the first cycle, it is fetched. In the second cycle, it is understood, and its operands R1 and R2 are fetched. In the third cycle, the addition of R1 and R2 is done by the ALU. No real activity happens in the fourth cycle. Right? So this is one of those hashed MEM stage boxes. And finally, in the fifth cycle, register R3 is updated with the sum. So we know exactly what happens as far as instruction I, the add instruction, is concerned. Okay, now let's suppose that the next instruction I plus 1, is a subtract instruction. In particular, let's suppose that the subtract instruction takes as its destination register R4, and its source operands are registers R3 and R8. Now, what will happen to this instruction? It will get fetched in cycle 2. It will get decoded and fetch its operands in cycle 3. It will execute the subtraction in cycle 4. The MEM is once again hashed, no real activity happening, and it will write back the result, the result of subtracting the contents of R3 and R8 into R4 in cycle number 6. Now, what's the problem with these two instructions? If you look at the instructions carefully, you'll notice that the first instruction has R3 as its destination. So this is instruction I. And the second instruction I plus 1, is modifying R4 and has R3 as a source. In other words, the second instruction is using as a source the value that is going to be computed by the first instruction. Now, this is a situation where there is a data relationship between these two instructions. The second instruction is dependent on the first instruction, so this might be called a data dependence or data dependency. But this is what we should note. This arrow which I've drawn over here is a very notable, something which we have to pay attention to, because this is a situation that is likely to lead to this hazard. Now, how do we reason about what's happening in the pipeline as far as the relationship between these two instructions is concerned? Now, just as we understood clearly what happens in each of the steps of the pipeline as far as instruction I is concerned, let's recall what will happen as far as instruction I plus 1 is concerned. It gets fetched in cycle 2. It reads the values in registers R3 and R8 in cycle 3. It does the subtraction in cycle 4. And it writes back the result into R4 in cycle 8. So what's the problem? The problem is that if we look at the point in time at which R3 is updated by instruction I, in other words, when does the value R3 become updated due to the activity of instruction I, we notice that that happens in cycle number 5, in the write back stage. On the other hand, when does instruction I plus 1 read the value from R3? And we know that that happens in cycle number 3. In other words, instruction I plus 1 is reading the value of R3 in cycle number 3. And instruction I is writing the desired value into R3 only in cycle number 5. So what is being read by instruction I plus 1 is not the value which is being written by instruction I. And this is a hazardous situation, because clearly the value that will be read by instruction I plus 1 must be an old value, the previous value that was in register R3, and not the value which was put into register R3 by the add instruction, instruction I. Therefore, if the instruction I plus 1 is allowed to proceed through the pipeline as per the plan shown on the timeline, along the timeline, then the subtract instruction will get the wrong value of register R3 and will produce the wrong result in register R4, and the program will not produce the correct result. In other words, the program will be in error. So correct program execution would not result if we used this implementation of the pipeline. The fault is not with the programmer. The programmer wrote a well-defined program in which there are 2 instructions, clearly indicating that the first instruction writes a result which is to be used by the second instruction. The problem is with the hardware. The hardware has not been properly designed to safely transfer the value computed by instruction I to instruction I plus 1. And that's why this is a hazardous situation. Okay, now just to outline this more clearly, the hazardous situation is evident from the fact that there are 2 instructions, one which is earlier in the pipeline and one which is one which is ahead in the pipeline, right? And one which is behind in the pipeline. And the instruction which is behind in the pipeline requires a value which is yet to be computed or yet to be made available by the one which is ahead in the pipeline. And therefore, if it read the value at the point in time that it was supposed to, would result in a wrong result. That's why this is defined as a hazardous situation. Now, we need to understand this hazard well, because very clearly this is the kind of situation that may arise in programs that we write. And we recognize that this is a legal sequence of instructions, and that in writing an instruction like instruction I followed by instruction I plus 1, we clearly understand that we intended the value computed by instruction I to be used by instruction I plus 1, and that therefore there must be mechanisms designed into pipelines through which this kind of a hazard is resolved. And we'll look at this problem and multiple solutions to this problem in the next lecture. Thank you.